A 13-year-old boy is placed on a throne in a kingdom his enemies call barbaric, and nobody expects him to last the year. This is the story of how Ying Zheng of Qin conquered 6 kingdoms, unified a fractured land, and became the first emperor of China, not through glory, but through patience, paranoia, and a vision so absolute it shaped an empire for 2,000 years. So settle in, let the distant clatter of crossbows fade, and listen as the dust settles on the warring states. Chapter 1. The Boy King. The year was 246 BC, and in the western state of Qin, a 13-year-old boy named Ying Zheng was about to become king. His father had died suddenly, leaving a child on a throne surrounded by wolves who had been circling for years. The court of Qin was a dangerous place for anyone, let alone a boy who had spent his early years as a hostage in a rival kingdom, where every meal could have been his last, and every smile might have hidden a blade. He had learned young that trust was a weapon other people used against you, and he learned it the hard way, by watching adults smile at him while they held him captive and fed him just enough to keep him alive, but not enough to let him forget who was in control. The nobles who gathered for his coronation did not bow low enough. Their eyes flicked sideways, measuring him the way a merchant measures a horse, calculating how much power they could strip away while the boy grew up. In a modern office, you would call it a hostile takeover in progress, except nobody was hiding their intentions. They simply did not believe that a child could see what they were doing, that a 13-year-old could understand the language of half-bows and averted gazes. His own mother, a former concubine named Xiao Ji, was maneuvering behind the scenes with her lover Lao Ai, positioning herself to rule through her son. Even his own family could not be trusted. But Ying Zheng had been watching people his entire short life. He had studied their hands, their breathing, the way they shifted their weight when they lied, the tiny tells that most people never notice. He was not the strongest person in the room, not by a long shot, but he was the one paying attention, and that made all the difference. The man who watches is the man who wins. And this boy was very, very good at watching. He sat on his throne with his hands folded and his face blank, memorizing every face in the room, filing away every half-bow and knowing glance for a day when he would have the power to act on what he had seen. That day would come eventually, but it was not today. For now, he would wait and learn and remember every single detail. Chapter 2. The First Lesson. 2 years into his reign, a delegation from the state of Zhao arrived at the Qin court, bearing gifts and promises of friendship. Ying Zheng was old enough now to sit in on the negotiations, though he said almost nothing. He watched the Zhao envoy's hands more than his face, because hands do not lie as well as faces do. The man had a habit of rubbing his thumb against his forefinger when he was nervous, and he was nervous a lot, even though his voice was smooth and his posture was perfect. His smile was wide and warm, the kind of smile that made you want to trust him, but his thumb kept moving back and forth, like a man counting seconds until he could leave. The alliance was sealed with wine and ceremony, and the Zhao delegation left with deep bows and respectful words that meant nothing at all. A week later, a cook in the Qin palace was found dead in the kitchen, curled up by the hearth, his face frozen in surprise and his hands still clutching a wooden spoon. Poison. The poison had been brought in by the Zhao delegation. hidden in a jar of honey meant for the young king's table, a gift of friendship that was actually a delivery of death. It had been a quiet assassination attempt, the kind that leaves no evidence and no witnesses, the kind that would have been blamed on a bad batch of ingredients if anyone had bothered to investigate. Nobody could prove it. The Zhao envoy had already crossed the border and was probably laughing about it with his king, celebrating a job well done. But Ying Zheng understood now, and the understanding settled into his bones like cold water seeping through a crack in a wall. The other states would never treat Qin as an equal. They saw his kingdom as barbaric, something to be destroyed or absorbed, and they would never stop trying. They would smile and promise peace while they sharpened their knives behind their backs. This was the moment that defined the rest of his life. The long game had begun, and the young king had just learned the first rule of survival in a world where everyone wanted him dead. There is no peace between rivals. There is only the pause between battles. Chapter 3. The Li Si Gambit. A low-born scholar named Li Si arrived at the Qin court with a reputation for brilliance and a complete lack of noble blood, which in any other kingdom would have been a career-ending disadvantage. In the Eastern courts, men were judged by their family names and their ancestors, by how many generations of nobility stood behind them. Li Si had no ancestors worth mentioning. He was the son of a minor clerk from a small town, a man who had started his career as a local bureaucrat processing tax documents, and his only inheritance was a sharp mind and a complete absence of patience for people who mistook birth for ability. But Ying Zheng's chief minister, a man named Lu Buwei, who had himself risen from merchant to statesman, recognized talent when he saw it, and brought Li Si into the fold. Li Si had studied under the same master as some of the greatest thinkers of the age, a philosopher named Sun Quan, who taught that human nature was inherently selfish and needed strict law to control it. This philosophy fit perfectly with what Li Si saw in the world around him. His plan was simple in theory and brutal in execution. Conquer the 6 other kingdoms one at a time, and before any army marched, send gold and spies ahead to soften the target. Bribe the ministers, spread rumors between allies, create distrust where there had been unity, make the enemy defeat themselves from the inside, so that by the time the army arrived at their borders, the war was already half won by men who never drew a sword. Ying Zheng listened to Li Si's proposal in complete silence, his face giving away nothing at all, the way a good poker player shows nothing to the table. The other courtiers in the room shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what the young king was thinking behind that blank mask. Then he nodded once, a small, nearly invisible gesture that changed the course of Chinese history forever. The scholar had said exactly what the young king had been thinking for years, but he had said it with a clarity that made the impossible seem routine. This was the beginning of the machine that would unite China. And it started not with a sword or a declaration of war, but with a quiet conversation between 2 men who understood that power was a problem to be solved, not a prize to be seized. Chapter 4. The Iron Army. The Qin army did not look like the armies of the other kingdoms, and that was entirely the point. Its soldiers wore uniforms of the same cut and color, so that from a distance they looked like a single moving wall of dark cloth and bronze plates, an army without individuality. They carried crossbows that were built to identical specifications, which meant any soldier could pick up any crossbow in the middle of a battle and it would shoot the same, at the same range, with the same force. In the other states, weapons were made by individual craftsmen, each one slightly different, each one known by its maker. A soldier in the state of Shao carried a sword that was uniquely his, a personal weapon made by a smith he knew by name, a family heirloom passed down through generations. This was considered honorable and traditional, the way things had always been done. In Qin, weapons were made in state-run factories and stamped with the date and the name of the foreman who had supervised their production. If a crossbow broke during a battle, they knew exactly who had made it, and that foreman faced consequences that made quality control a matter of personal survival rather than professional pride. This kind of standardization does not make for a dramatic story, but it makes for a terrifying army. A Qin soldier did not fight for glory or for his lord's honor. He did not sing songs about his ancestors while charging into battle. He fought because he got a promotion and a plot of his own land for every enemy head he brought back to camp. He fought because his unit was drilled every single day until every man moved exactly the same way, until the formation was a single organism with 1,000 legs and 1,000 arms. There was nothing romantic about this army at all. It was simply the most efficient killing machine the world had ever seen, and it was built on the quiet insight that consistency was far more valuable than bravery. 1,000 men who moved as one will defeat 10,000 men who move as individuals, and the Qin army understood this truth better than any army before it. They had learned that discipline was not about punishment. It was about making every soldier trust the man beside him completely. Chapter 5. The Waiting Game. For years, Qin did not attack anyone at all. The other kingdoms watched the western border nervously, waiting for the barbarians to charge across the plains with fire and screaming and the thunder of hooves. But nothing happened. Month after month, season after season, year after year, the border stayed completely quiet. Ying Zheng was patient, and patience was his most dangerous weapon, more dangerous than any crossbow or siege engine ever built. While the other states bickered and formed alliances that broke apart as soon as they were signed. While their kings feuded and their generals postured and their armies drilled for wars that never came, Qin was working in a different way entirely. Caravans of merchants crossed into enemy territory carrying silk and jade and fine bronze mirrors, the ordinary goods of trade that nobody thought twice about. But they also carried gold coins for the pockets of corrupt ministers and secret messages for the spies, who had been placed years earlier. Ordinary-looking people who had integrated into their new communities, waiting for instructions that would arrive with the next merchant caravan. Qin agents spread rumors in the tea-houses and marketplaces of the eastern capitals, whispering over cups of tea that the king of Wei could not be trusted, that the king of Shao was secretly planning to betray his allies and carve out a larger kingdom for himself. These rumors were small and plausible, the kind of casual gossip that gets repeated over dinner until it becomes accepted truth, the foundation of any good conspiracy theory. The alliances crumbled without a single Qin soldier crossing a border. The 6 kingdoms could not fight a common enemy because they could not agree on who the common enemy even was anymore. Their suspicion of each other was stronger than their fear of Qin, and that suspicion had been carefully cultivated, watered like a garden. This was war fought with ledgers and whispers, not swords, and it worked because nobody in the other courts believed that a barbarian kingdom from the west could be subtle enough to pull it off. They were looking for an army on the horizon. They did not see the merchants in their own marketplaces, and they never saw the gold changing hands in their own palaces. They were looking for something dramatic and obvious, the kind of threat that comes with trumpets and banners and shouting generals. They did not understand that the most dangerous threats are the ones that look ordinary, the ones you would never think to guard against. Chapter 6. The First Kingdom. In 230 BC, Qin finally moved. The target was Han, the smallest of the warring states, wedged between Qin and the larger kingdoms like a bone between two hungry dogs, too small to defend itself and too exposed to hide anywhere. Han had been watching the border for so long that they had exhausted themselves waiting. Their scouts had been on alert for years, and the constant tension had worn down their morale the way water wears down stone, slowly and inevitably. When the Qin army finally marched, it was not a surprise in the military sense. Everyone knew it was coming eventually. The surprise was how fast it happened, how smoothly the machine operated after years of stillness, like a wheel that had been greased and waiting. The king of Han looked at his options with the careful calculation of a man who had run out of good choices entirely. He could fight a war he would almost certainly lose, costing thousands of his people's lives and ending with his capital city in flames, and his family dead or captured. He could flee and become a king without a kingdom, wandering the eastern states as a beggar in silk robes, a figure of pity and mockery wherever he went. Or he could surrender and keep his head, and maybe keep his people alive in the process. He chose surrender, and honestly, it was probably the smartest decision he ever made in his entire reign, because it saved thousands of lives that would have been lost in a hopeless war. The First Kingdom fell without a single battle, without a single arrow fired in anger, without a single soldier dying on either side. The court of Han was absorbed into Qin's growing administration, and the Han king was given a small estate somewhere quiet in the countryside, where he could live out his days in comfortable irrelevance, growing vegetables and pretending he had never been a king at all. The other states realized what was happening now, that a predator was among them, and it had already started feeding on the weakest member of the herd. But it was too late to unite against the threat, because they had spent too many years fighting each other to trust each other now. Distrust is a poison that takes generations to cure, and they had been drinking it for decades. Chapter 7. The Siege of Shao. Shao was not Han. Shao was the kingdom that had once held Ying Zheng hostage, the kingdom that had tried to poison him with honey. There would be no surrender here, no quiet retirement to a vegetable garden. The siege of Handan, Zhao's capital, was long and ugly and hungry, the kind of siege that poets write about and generals try to forget. The Qin army surrounded the city and simply waited, because time was a weapon too, and they had more of it than the people inside the walls. The walls of Handan were thick and well built, the kind of walls that had stood for generations and seemed like they would stand forever. But walls cannot stop hunger, and they cannot stop disease, and they cannot stop the slow decay of hope. Inside the city, food ran low within months. People ate the horses first, then the dogs, then the rats that scurried through the sewers. Disease spread faster than the rumors, and the dead were stacked in courtyards like firewood because there was no room left in the graveyards, and nobody had the strength to dig new ones. The Shao king sent desperate messages to the other states, begging for military help. But the alliances that had once bound them together had been thoroughly poisoned by years of Qin gold and carefully placed whispers. Wei sent a small army that marched halfway and then turned back when their scouts reported the size of the Qin encampment. The Zhao defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they had no other option. And courage is a real thing. It matters in battle. But courage does not fill a stomach. The city held for months, then a year. And then the gates opened one morning, not because the walls had fallen to siege engines or because the soldiers had been defeated, but because the people inside could not face another winter of starvation and frozen ground. Ying Zheng gave orders that the Zhao royal family be treated with dignity and respect, that they be given proper housing and food. But he never forgot the poison in the honey jar, and he made sure that the Zhao nobles knew that he remembered. Some things you cannot forgive, even when you choose not to take revenge. The memory stays like a scar that aches when the weather changes. Chapter 8. The Breath. The rains came late that year, and for a few weeks the army stopped moving. The roads turned to thick mud that swallowed chariot wheels up to the axle, and even the most eager general knows better than to march an army through mud like that. Ying Zheng took advantage of the unexpected pause to ride through the captured streets of Handan with only a small escort. Past empty markets and shuttered homes, where families huddled in the darkness, afraid to show their faces. The city was quiet in a way that living cities never are. It had the silence of exhaustion, the stillness of a place that has been squeezed dry of everything, including hope. He dismounted at the Zhao Palace and walked through rooms that still smelled of incense and old fear, the faded perfume of a royal family that had lived their entire lives believing they were safe behind their walls, never understanding that no wall is thick enough to stop time. He found a study on the upper floor with scrolls stacked on a desk. Hafrid, abandoned in a hurry when the news of the surrender arrived through the window, along with the sound of the gates opening. The king of Shao had been reading a poem about autumn leaves when the messenger knocked. He had put the scroll down gently, as if he expected to come back to it later, and he never picked it up again. Ying Zheng sat in the dead king's chair, which was still warm from the body that had occupied it hours earlier, and looked out the window at a city that no longer belonged to anyone. The rain fell on the rooftops, and the streets ran with water, and he sat there alone for what felt like a very long time. His guards waited outside the door, exchanging nervous glances, wondering what their emperor was doing alone in a conquered king's study for so many hours. But they did not dare to interrupt his silence because nobody knew what he was thinking, and that was how he liked it. The war was not the hard part, he realized as he sat there in the stillness with only the sound of rain for company. Any man with enough soldiers and enough patience could take a city. The hard part was deciding what to do with it afterwards, how to make it yours without crushing it into dust and ash and bitter memory. Chapter 9. The Flood. Wei fell next, and then Q, and neither fell the same way, which showed that the first emperor was learning and adapting as he went. The campaign against Chu was the hardest of all the conquests, the one that nearly broke the machine. Chu was a massive kingdom stretching across the south, with thick bamboo forests that swallowed whole armies without a trace, swamps that could drown a man in 3 steps if he did not know the paths, and rivers that flooded without warning and changed course every season. Qin's General Wang Jian, a man who looked like a farmer and fought like an accountant, asked for an enormous army of 600,000 men, far larger than anyone thought necessary for the campaign. Ying Zheng gave it to him without argument, because he had learned by now to trust the men who did not promise easy victories, the men who looked at a problem and asked for exactly what they needed. Wang Jian did not rush into the forests of Ku like a younger general might have. He built fortifications, secured supply lines that stretched back to Qin, and waited for the Chu army to make the first mistake, patient as stone. It took 2 years of waiting, but the Chu army eventually ran out of food because they had not planned for a siege that would last that long, and they scattered into the swamps where the Qin soldiers hunted them down methodically, without haste or mercy, like men clearing a field of pests. Wei fell by a different method entirely, one that showed the first emperor's willingness to use nature itself as a weapon. Qin diverted a river to flood the Wei capital, and the city became a swamp within days. Soldiers drowned in their own barracks without ever seeing an enemy sword. Grain stores that could have fed the city for months were ruined by water. The siege walls, built to withstand battering rams and catapults, collapsed under the slow, relentless pressure of water. It was not a clean victory, and it left a city of corpses floating in muddy water. But it was efficient, and efficiency was all that mattered to the first emperor now. The remaining states watched the floodwaters recede from the drowned city and understood that nothing in the world would stop the machine that was coming for them. Chapter 10. The Last Enemy. Qi was the richest state of all, the last remaining independent kingdom among the 7 that had fought each other for centuries. It was protected by the sea on one side, and by decades of careful diplomacy on the other, and its king honestly believed that Qi was safe because it was too far away and too wealthy to conquer. This was the kind of confidence that came from never having been tested, the unearned confidence of a man who has always been comfortable and assumes that comfort will last forever. Like a modern person who has never experienced a real crisis and believes that the system will always protect them. When the Qin army appeared at the border after marching through territories that had once been independent kingdoms, the Qi court fell into chaos and panic. The ministers who had been taking Qin gold for years argued that surrender was the wise and honorable choice. That resistance would only lead to unnecessary bloodshed and the destruction of everything they had built. The generals argued that they should fight, that Qi's walls were strong and its treasury was full and its army was well equipped and ready. But the king listened to the ministers because they were the men he had trusted and dined with and joked with for years. The men whose advice had always served him well, the men he called his friends. He did not know that their loyalty had been purchased long ago with Qin gold, that every dinner conversation and every friendly toast had been feeding him poison disguised as wisdom. Qi surrendered without a single arrow fired in its defense. The ministers who had been bought with Qin gold smiled and congratulated each other on a peaceful resolution. The generals looked at their weapons and wondered why they had trained their whole lives for a war that never came. The unification was finally complete, after 25 years of planning and patience and careful clawing upward. Ying Zheng declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a united China, the first man in history to rule all the Chinese kingdoms as one land under one ruler. He was 38 years old, and 25 years had passed since a frightened 13-year-old boy had been placed on a throne that nobody thought he would keep. The empire he had dreamed of in his cold and lonely childhood, the empire that had seemed impossible when he was a hostage in Shao, watching the guards outside his window and wondering if he would live to see another morning, was now unquestionably and completely real. Chapter 11. One World. Conquering the kingdoms had taken a decade. Ruling them would take the rest of his life, and Qin Shi Huang understood something that most conquerors in history never figured out. You cannot hold an empire together with armies alone. The fist eventually tires. The sword eventually rusts. The soldier eventually goes home to his family. What holds an empire together is paperwork, standards, and the slow grinding work of making everybody follow the same rules, whether they like it or not. He standardized everything that could possibly be standardized. The written script was unified into a single system of characters, which meant that a man from the far south, near the jungles, could read the same official documents as a man from the northern plains where the nomads roamed. Axle widths for carts were set to a single measurement across the entire empire, which meant that the network of roads he built could be used by any vehicle, without getting stuck in the ruts left by a different-sized cart. Think about that the next time you buy a phone charger that actually works with your device. 2,000 years ago, a Chinese emperor solved the compatibility problem with an entire empire, and he did it with nothing but bronze tools and bureaucratic will. Currency was standardized to a single round bronze coin with a square hole in the middle, small enough to carry on a string tied around the waist. The kind of coin that would be used continuously in China for the next 2,000 years. Weights and measures were made uniform across all the former kingdoms, so that a bushel of grain in the east weighed exactly the same as a bushel of grain in the west, and a foot in the north was the same as a foot in the south. This was dull work, bureaucratic work, the kind of tedious standardization that does not appear in epic poems or dramatic movies about ancient China. But this was the work that actually held the empire together. When the armies had marched away, bureaucracy, standardization, system, it was boring and relentless, and absolutely brilliant. And it was the single reason that China would survive as a unified entity long after the first emperor's own dynasty had fallen to rebellion. The conquerors who came after him could take the throne, but they could not undo the roads and the writing, and the coins that now connected north and south and east and west into something that had never existed before. Chapter 12. The Clay Army. In his final years, Qin Shi Huang became obsessed with immortality, the way that powerful men often do when they realize that their power, no matter how absolute, will not protect them from death. He sent expeditions across the known world to find the elixir of life. Parties of ships and soldiers that sailed into the eastern sea looking for islands where immortals were said to live. He drank mercury potions prescribed by alchemists who promised eternal youth, not realizing that mercury is a slow and terrible poison. And these potions probably killed him faster than any disease would have. But while he searched for a way to live forever, he also built his tomb with the same methodical thoroughness he had applied to everything else in his life. An underground palace the size of a small city, with rivers of liquid mercury flowing through channels carved into the earth to simulate the rivers of China. A ceiling painted with the constellations of the night sky in their correct positions, and replicas of his palaces and his provinces laid out in miniature below, and standing guard over it all an army of terracotta soldiers, thousands upon thousands of them, each one uniquely sculpted with a different face and different features, each one representing a real soldier who had served in his campaigns. They carried real bronze weapons, swords and spears and crossbows that were fully functional, standing in battle formation underground, facing east toward the conquered kingdoms as if they were still waiting for an attack that would never come. The first emperor died in 210 BC while on a tour of his empire, traveling through the eastern provinces, and his death was kept secret for weeks while his ministers arranged the succession. They wrapped his body in fish to cover the smell and continued the tour as if he was still alive, because they knew that the news of his death would cause the conquered kingdoms to rise up in rebellion. The empire he had built collapsed within a few years of his passing, falling into a brutal civil war as his son proved incapable of holding together what his father had created. But the idea he had created, the idea that China was one thing, one land with one written language, and one system of measurement, and one way of doing things, that idea did not die with him. It survived, it stayed. It became the foundation of every dynasty that followed. And 2,000 years later, the clay soldiers still stand in their underground ranks, 8,000 of them, each one unique, each one facing east, waiting for a command that will never come.